Well, Reb, we'll go ahead and pass it on over to you and let us get started. I'm excited about this one.
Well, listen, I want to offer my warm welcome to everybody who's here. And for those that have signed up and aren't able to be with us live, you're going to get a recording of what's going to transpire over the next hour. My name is Reverend Jim Antal, and I'm retired as conference minister of the Massachusetts Conference, back when there was a Massachusetts Conference. And since that time, I've been serving as the general minister and president of our denomination as his special advisor on climate justice. And Michael Malcolm, who most of you know, he and Brooks Burnt and I, we get into trouble together. We get into trouble on your behalf and on behalf of the earth we call home. Brooks is on sabbatical right now, and so I'm stepping in for him, and as we often do, teaming together with Michael. And we are welcoming today Gus Speth, who is a close friend of mine and who I will introduce in a moment. But before we get to that, I want to turn the mic over to Michael, who wants to give us a brief update on what's been happening down south and some particular needs that are there. Michael, you want to speak to that?
Yeah, well, Jim, normally I would open this with words or a theological thought of some sort or words of encouragement just to set us up and give us premise. But I think because of the climate devastation that we've experienced, as recent as Hurricane Ida, it has left us with a plea that our communities get involved, but it also helps to set up what we're going to discuss today. Because those who are in New Orleans, those who are in Louisiana who experience the biggest brunt, as well as those who are in the Gulf South throughout, who experience the brunt of Hurricane Ida, are now experiencing a loss of electricity. And the government is saying that it will be the end of September before they'll have electricity. Now, we know that there are people who are under medical care. There are people, or infants who need nutrition that needs to be refrigerated. We've got elderly people who experience heat differently than we do, not just to mention those who are in environmental justice areas who experience heat sinks or heat islands. And they get the temperatures a lot worse than what we see them on the news. And not to have AC, not to have cool water, not to have refrigerated food is very, very problematic to the human condition. And so we need solar panels. We need solar panels. We need people to be able to set up solar throughout New Orleans, throughout Louisiana, throughout the Gulf South. And so we're asking congregations, in particular my UCC congregations, because we know that the UCC leads the way when it comes down to justice. Everybody else is behind us, catching up. And so I challenge anybody else who's not UCC to do better than what we're going to do. But the UCC is going to do something dope to make sure that our people in the Gulf South are cared for. So if you would, get in touch with the Gulf South Care, the Gulf Care, I'm sorry, Gulf Coast Coalition. I will put their information in the chat, and so you'll be able to get in touch with them directly. But I need for people of faith to take the lead on this, and I'm challenging people of faith. I even wore my clergy collar today so that I can look like a reverend today for you all. Even though, Reb, I read the cover of Gus's book, and I told y'all I started to put my fatigues on and my combat boots because I'm ready to go to war. Because listen, they knew. And right now, our government is failing those people in the Gulf South in a real way. It is time for community, and in particular, those of faith, to take leadership in showing how we can care for one another, even when our government fails. Thank you for your time, and I'll turn it back over to your hands, Jim.
Well, thank you for that. You provided us with inspiration and something we can do with the gifts that God has given us. So thank you, Michael. So now I want to introduce my friend, Gus Speth, who has been one of America's foremost environmental leaders. Gus and I met in jail 10 years ago when we were both arrested and jailed for 3 days and nights for trying to persuade President Obama to cancel the Keystone XL pipeline. While we were in jail, Bill McKibben invited Gus to address the 40 of us in the men's cell block. Now, I knew that Gus had recently retired as the dean of the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. But I did not know that he had served as the chair of the U.S. Council on Environmental Quality during the Carter administration and as administrator for the United Nations Development Program, not to mention having co-founded the World Resources Institute and the National Resource Defense Council. Since our time in jail, my wife and I have retired to Vermont, only a few miles from where Gus and his wife Cameron live, and we are blessed to be able to see them with some frequency. Now, something Gus said years ago at a United Nations meeting has been quoted, especially by clergy, countless times. And I want to read what Gus said. And after I do that, after we get going here, I will post this quote for you in the chat. I used to think that if we threw enough good science at environmental problems, we could solve them. I was wrong. The main threats to the environment are not biodiversity loss, pollution, and climate change, as I once thought. They are selfishness and greed and pride. And for that, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. Gus is among the expert witnesses who will be called when and if the Juliana versus the United States case is tried. This case is also known as Our Children's Trust. His testimony for that case is captured in his newest book, They Knew: the US federal government's 50-year role in causing the climate crisis. And that book has just been released by MIT Press. So Gus, we'll get to your new book in a moment, but first, let's begin with the organization, Our Children's Trust, and the case of Juliana versus the United States. Now, I know you do a lot of public speaking and nowadays Zoom speaking, and oftentimes you have lawyers as your audience. But we're not a bunch of lawyers here. It looks to me like there's 155 people here, but most of us are people of faith. So I think we can understand this. As a matter of fact, several years ago, 5 years ago, Brooks and I launched a campaign to get 1,000 sermons preached on the Juliana versus the US case. So could you provide our audience with a brief overview of this case?
Well, Jim, thank you for having me, and it's good to see Michael. Also, it's a good introduction that Michael made to our presentation also, because clearly for the first time, the news media and our president are linking these natural disasters, so-called natural disasters, to climate change. And that's what the lawsuit is about, and that's what my book is about. We now see at the forefront of the climate movement in the country, young people, the youth movement in the climate area. And it really is inspiring. But in a way, I think it started with this lawsuit. Jim mentioned 5 years ago, getting on to about 6, I think, isn't it, Jim? When our children's trust, a really effective advocacy for children based in Oregon, helped to organize these 21 youth plaintiffs to sue the federal government to compel climate action. And over that time, our federal government has basically done everything possible through the Justice Department to prevent the case from coming to trial. And it continues today with the Biden administration. And I think it's a pretty disgraceful record of judicial malperformance. But there it is. The gist of the case is that the Constitution, under the Due Process Clause, prevents the federal government from creating a situation of grave endangerment. Playing a leading role in the creation of this current climate crisis, which is a situation of grave endangerment. And so to prevail in the case, the plaintiffs have to show that there really has been this role of the federal government in creating the current situation that we now see unfolding in California fires and West Coast, Western US drought and hurricanes and floods. It's all upon us. And so my job, when they first asked me to do the Carter administration, would you write up the Carter administration? I said, oh yeah, four years, I can do that.
And you were in that administration, of course, right?
I was there, so I knew a little bit, and I knew I could write it up. So, and then when I finished, they said, now would you do all the other administrations? And I picked myself up off the floor and started work in 2018. And I've worked on it off and on since, but it was submitted to the courts, and we're waiting it to be used in a court setting. And I've updated it now for publication, adding some new material, and particularly the disastrous Trump finale. So it is so the book, the lawsuit is endeavoring to show that the federal government played this negative role, not just a passive role of letting it happen, but a negative role in permitting, in licensing, in leasing, in approving all kinds of things, in selling fossil fuels. A huge portion of our US fossil fuel use today is from federally owned resources. And so it hasn't been at all passive. And there's been this policy throughout every administration I looked at of trying to sustain fossil fuel use. So it is. So I think we've made the case, and we've just got to get into court and show that. And once you conclude that the federal government has a big responsibility in creating this disastrous situation that young people face today and that future generations will face, well, the government then has to meet a standard of protecting the climate, and whatever Congress might do or others might do, this provides a center lane that the government can't get very far off of. It's got to move down that center lane to get this job done of sustaining a climate that's safe and habitable for future generations.
So Gus,
that's the lawsuit, Jim.
Gus, one of the things you said, I think it seems to me, if I was not everybody on this call are pastors, but everybody on this call has a link with a pastor, of course. And if I were a pastor preaching on this, I think I would want to know more. Of course, I could go to your book to figure out exactly what the details are about what it is the government knew and how they ignored their knowledge about climate change and instead helped promote the oil industry, the coal industry, and the gas industry. If that's one thing from your book, that pastors should be preaching about. Can you just name a couple of other things maybe that, as you think about all the things that you uncovered in your writing, in your testimony, other things that might make for an interesting sermon on climate change? Just a couple of ideas there.
Well, there are some lessons, and perhaps they would be useful. But and let me relate a few. I looked at the whole 50-year period from LBJ through Trump, and every administration was presented, starting with certainly with Carter and even before, solid science pointing to the need to reorient our energy policy and get off of fossil fuels. Obviously, Carter in 1980, we had a lot more time if we'd started then to get the job done safely and smoothly. But every administration was presented with extensive scientific information. Every administration was also presented with tons of information about how alternative directions for energy policy and the need to move to renewables and to energy efficiency, going back to Carter. And thirdly, every administration did everything it could do pretty much to promote fossil fuels and to sustain, license, permit, fund the fossil fuel economy, research fracking and promote fracking recently. And so that's the pattern. So what are some lessons from this? One is, well, it's pretty hard to trust the federal government. If history is any guide, we've run a 50-year experiment on whether we can trust the federal government, and we've learned that we can't. They're not going to do the right thing under the circumstances that we've been living through. Secondly, there's tremendous inertia in the current system, tremendous, and it's a product of the great power and money of the fossil fuel industry, which exists from small scale companies to some of the biggest companies in the world. And they don't mind throwing their weight around. They don't even mind throwing around misinformation. And they've done it. It's also, this inertia is a product of our beholding to an economy which is hooked on growth. And anything that begins to threaten growth is going to be, they're going to run away from it. And this growth, of course, is growth measured by GDP. And GDP measures all the bad things as money. And so if you're trying to ramp up GDP, well, all the things you're paying for to clean up the climate mess and to deal with all the problems that we're now experiencing all up and down the East Coast, for example, and in the West, that's all money spent because of climate. So, and a lot of terrible things for GDP covers. And so we have this problem. And the third factor has been, in this period, we've had the rise of the radical right. And this group of people, for now considerable, are very anti-government, anti-regulation. Their leader at one time was a man named Grover Norquist, who famously said, "Our job is to shrink government down so small that we can drown it in a bathtub." And he meant it. And they just, this group is started in a way with Reagan, or certainly launched publicly in a way with Reagan, with his comment that government is not the solution to your problems, government is the problem, in Reagan's famous statement. And all that's combined to make progress very hard. We've also learned, I think, another lesson, which is that the good science is not enough. We've had a lot of that. We've learned that comfortable advocacy, I would call it comfortable advocacy, is not enough. We've had a lot of that, and that's indeed been most of my life. And they're important, but they're not enough. We've learned that neither party is very reliable on this issue. I would say one is more reliable than others, but neither has been stellar by any means. And I might talk about the Biden situation momentarily, but in the administrations and the Congresses that I reviewed, nobody gets a big hug. So my conclusion and the final lesson in a way is that we need a massive, we need two or three things, but one is a massive civil mobilization. Not one-off demonstrations here and there, but just a constant pounding on the system from people in small groups and big groups, acting out in comic things and doing very serious things, getting arrested, civil disobedience, large-scale continuing, involving minorities and people of color, frontline communities, farmers, labor members, and working people, and really the whole country needs to get into this. And secondly, I think we need we need the courts. We've had a default on the part of both other branches, the branches you would normally look to, and we really need the courts. And the courts have stepped up to this in several European countries and Australia, and we need some rulings. And in particular, what the Juliana case that I'm involved with is seeking is a ruling that we have that the people in general, but also particularly young people and future generations, need constitutional protection. And that constitutional protection will transcend any particular administration. And if things start sliding backwards after Biden, for example, that guardrail will be there, that center line will be there. Those are the lessons I've come to, Jim, after living with all of this information.
Yep, Jim, can I jump in real quick and just, you said quite a bit that made me want to put my combat boots on. But something in particular you said is, and you say I'll talk about it later, but you talked about no government is really good on this issue. And I have gone to northern Minnesota to fight against Line 3. I have been to West Virginia, and this has happened this summer. Been to West Virginia to fight against the Mountain Valley Pipeline. Been down to Uniontown to look at the landfill that's filled with coal ash sitting in the middle of that community. I've gone to Gloucester and Bond, Mississippi, where they have a biomass plant sitting right literally in their backyard. And all of these things are permitted by the government. And this happened this summer. Trump wasn't in office this summer. That was a different administration in office this summer. So the fight is against evil, period. Period. The destruction of planet and people over profit. That's the fight. That's the fight.
Michael, that's fantastic that you've been there. And it's, and I think you're right. So we have to, if you want to talk about the Biden administration for a second, is that all right? Do that? Well, first, Biden has committed the country to some remarkable goals. And I think there is a precedent-setting situation here where he, for the first administration, has said, we're going to get out of fossil fuels, effectively reducing fossil fuel use down to something very small by mid-century. And the goals are quite dramatic, including the sort of capstone goal of no net emissions of greenhouse gases in the United States in 2050. which is for those of young people is really not very far away. It's their lifetimes basically, and so that's important. And Biden has put in place some really good policies and put in place some initiatives that could become good policies if enacted by the Congress in this $3.5 trillion package, infrastructure package, through the reconciliation process. I've heard Senator Sanders speak to that package, which he had a lot to do in putting together and deserves a lot of credit for. And there's a lot of important things in there about climate. I wish I knew more about all that was in there on the climate issue. The news media is pretty poor about really understanding what's in there. But I trust Bernie. And there are things that EPA needs to do and other agencies need to do. You can't spend $3.5 trillion into the economy in a decade and not ramp up greenhouse gas emissions dramatically. So what you need to do is have a regulatory program that simultaneously is insisting on those gases going down. And that will drive deeper change in our energy policy, in our energy reliance. But it will, and importantly, it will also reduce our greenhouse gas emissions in a guaranteed way. So we have a model to really address this problem in the old Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, which said this sector is going to do this by this date, and this sector is going to do this, and this sector is going to do that. And it just regulated the reduction of pollutants. And we need to bring that tough, hard-nosed regulatory approach, which is backed by affirmative citizen action to drive down greenhouse gas emissions. So Biden is in the middle of this is absolutely critical moment right now, because he's fighting probably for the fate of his presidency, and certainly it's a big contribution to the fate of the planet is whether he gets this done and whether his agencies step up to the plate and do the regulating for greenhouse gas reductions. So here we are. We're at an absolutely critical moment, and it's time to, as you've done, Michael, get off our behinds and get out there and make our voices heard.
This exchange that the two of you just had, I think was just tremendous, because it lets all the people that are hearing us recognize that the challenge here is not a Republicans are good guys or bad guys, Democrats are good guys or bad guys. It turns out that the influence of the fossil fuel industry to attempt to maintain normal, to attempt to not have to give up $33 trillion of stranded assets. That's a big deal. And so that's going to be my pivot, Gus, to just ask you to say a few things, again, for those pastors and people who may have influence on their pastors. Say a few things about economics, which, in addition to the legal system, in addition to the environmental system, you know a heck of a lot about economics. In fact, Gus wrote this book also, The Bridge to the End of the World. And it was in that book that I learned the concept of externalities. And I talk about that in my book on climate change in a religious context. But Gus, I just wanted to, is capitalism the enemy, Gus? Or do we in fact have an imposter form of capitalism that we are in the midst of now? And all we need to do is to make a few pivots. And if so, what might those pivots be? What could you imagine coming from the mouth of a preacher in relation to this?
You mean other than sinners in the hands of an angry God?
Well, that's a good place to start.
I think I would begin by saying we have to walk on 2 feet. One is to get things that Biden wants to get done. to get the things that our system can do done. Get the best performance we can out of this rather sad political economy that we try to work in. And that's important. And it's what we can work on today. But, starting very late today, and so certainly tomorrow, we need to walk on the other leg, and that is to try to dig more deeply and promote changes in the system that will benefit us all. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean, right now, we're trying to go up a very fast down escalator, and it could get faster. And we are trying to make progress in a system that prizes, perhaps above all, economic growth measured by rotten measure, GDP, profit, including particularly corporate profit. It prizes that allows a vast economic inequity to exist. It allows a vast economic insecurity to exist in the country, poverty at an all-time high, wages stagnating now for decades. This system allows these things to happen. It prizes, it facilitates great bastions of corporate power. And underlying all that is it plays endlessly to our consumerism of values that are extremely materialistic. And you mentioned earlier the need for a value transformation. I mean, we're severely materialistic, we're anthropocentric, contempocentric, and we really have lost touch with the spiritual values and the things that so many faith communities urge us to attend to. And this has been, so this is these factors that we're warring against, that we're trying to make progress against. And it's almost impossible. Some is possible. We'll get it, let's get that done. But in the end, we've got to change these factors. And that means to me, deep change, which driven sufficiently changes the nature of the system that we are working in. So I say to my environmental friends, what's an environmental issue? The climate change, biodiversity loss? Yes, of course. But what if an environmental issue is also those things that war against environmental progress, that prevent environmental progress from achieving, what we need? And then if you ask, well, what are those things? Well, certainly an absolutely a failing politics, a badly corrupted democracy with money, overwhelming commitment on consumerism and the shop till you drop. We're no better on that than we were when people started raising these issues. It's just phenomenal what we're constantly barraged with advertisements and blandishments about all the great things that can come from buying a car. I mean, I watch the ball games, so I see all the car ads and just think, I mean, you can get women and vacation and surfing, time and all kinds of things out of buying a car. So they really know how to play to our weaknesses. But so I think the other environmental issues are this vast inequity in the society, and the divisions in our country. I mean, these things all war against environmental progress, and yet the environmental groups don't embrace these issues as environmental concerns.
Right.
And maybe the faith communities can help us in our country to see that there's a much broader agenda that needs to be addressed to achieve environmental progress. And sticking within the environmental confines, the cocoon that we really spun back in the 70s, is not going to deal with environmental problems of, in the depth and the profound way that they need to be addressed, or the speed that they need to be addressed. So we need to drive a deeper change to new indicators, to new types of business management and business corporations, new types of ownership, new banking arrangements that are with a heavy democratic input on where investments go, and not just all for profit, but also, not just financial return, but also environmental and social return. We need new indicators of progress, a whole array of things. So you can separate this need for system change out into a series of a dozen or so separate issues. And we know how to pursue down each of those separate dozen paths. And that's really what my other books that you mentioned have dealt with. And we need to start down those paths as fast as we can drive change.
Well, I would recommend to anybody listening to this, in particular, this book, because it will enlighten you and it will give you all kinds of things to preach on. And of course, I could go on and on, but I'm going to turn things over to Michael. Michael, maybe you've picked out from the chat and from the Q&A some questions for Gus. Take it away.
I've got a few here, Gus, that have been asked by the audience. One is one person asked or said they'd be interested in knowing your thoughts about carbon pricing as part of the solution.
Well, I think one way of looking at carbon pricing are these policy measures that try to put a carbon tax out there, or otherwise provide a fee, and I think those things are fine. And would I love to see it in the current context? Absolutely. I think the proposal that would have a fee and dividend with the proceeds from these taxes, fees would be returned to the public and in a progressive way. That would be good. I think, however, that we are past the point where we should focus on a carbon tax or a fee or a cap and trade type programs. I think we need regulatory action that, as I mentioned earlier, we have a model in the Air Act and the Water Act. There've been some really creative writing about how to go about it, and looking at the whole economy from the point of view of which sectors you do need regulations for, and which segments could you use the market mechanism for. And so it's sophisticated, and we need to pursue it. But in the end, I come down for tough regulatory action.
Thank you. I had another question in the chat as well concerning the case. Where are they in the case now? It was thought that it had been thrown out by one court. Where are they with the case now?
Well, you mentioned one court. The poor plaintiffs in this case have been up to the Supreme Court now several times, and in the Court of Appeals in the Ninth Circuit several times. And what they have proposed is they amend their complaint to the court, their complaint against the defendants, the government. They want to amend it to take care of the problems that they ran into in the earlier phase of the litigation. And so that is what is pending now in the district court in Oregon. And it is still alive very much. And we're sort of awaiting a court decision on whether to accept this amended complaint. And to our dismay, or their dismay, because I'm not really directly involved in the litigation. The Biden administration is not coming to agree to that, accept that amended complaint, or settle the case, which it would be in its advantage to do. So we, I think it's, Michael, you mentioned the fact that the administration seems to be plunging ahead with approvals and things. I think, one hope that we have is that the new administration's values and understandings and approach have just not permeated down into the Justice Department and into the permitting agencies and the lower reaches of the federal government yet. Maybe that's too charitable, but I hope that it's true. And that would mean, that the new policies that the president has spoken so much about will catch up with the Justice Department one day, and hopefully soon.
I'll be honest with you, Brother Gus, I'd love for that to be the case as well. I'm currently working with the administration on various issues about the infrastructure bill, along with other organizations in the climate movement. And I'm not as charitable.
Right.
To be honest with you, even with the infrastructure bill that we have, it's attached to the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And that particular infrastructure bill basically harms NEPA. NEPA is one of in the environmental justice movement, our biggest agencies that we use to fight against some of the false solutions and the bad structures that come into or bad projects rather that come into our communities. And so by attaching this to it and say, we've got to pass this in order to pass that, you've not entertained those who suffer still. And I'm concerned with the lack of care or the lack of concern with those who suffer now. We even in our discussion, we've skirted around the fact that we've got a bad racial issue here in this society. And we've got to deal with that, because that right there is one of the biggest hindrances to our existence as a people, because that is one of our biggest contributors to our climate devastation that we have. The Gulf South, the reason why that hurricane was as bad as it is because the waters is as warm as they are. The reason why the waters are as warm as they are is because of industry basically heating that place up way hotter than, and that's not a natural disaster, that's an unnatural disaster that's created by something or some force that we have something to do with, and we've got to take responsibility for it. So I'm not as charitable with our government still passing bills and still allowing permits and plans to go forth that we knowingly know cause us to have harm in these communities. And let me be clear, these EJ communities that I speak of weren't just Black and brown communities. West Virginia, I was one of 4 Black people in that whole camp. Everybody else was white. But the same stories that I heard from all my Black and brown brothers and sisters, my indigenous brothers and sisters that were in North Minnesota, are the same stories that I was hearing in West Virginia. And the stories were, the government has abandoned us. And that's the same stories that those Julian's brothers and sisters are saying. Our government is abandoning our future. And if there's nothing else that we as faith leaders should be fighting for, it should be for a future and for a people to have a future. Period.
Well, I couldn't agree more with you. I think that's well said. I think we have early on in my career, I began to see the importance of the environmental justice concern. And I remember I invited Bob Bullard, one of the founders of this environmental justice area, onto our transition team that was leading into the Clinton-Gore administration. but we haven't done enough in that area. And one of the great developments most recently has been the emergence of the environmental justice movement and, full force, I think, in the things that you're talking about, and particularly the adoption of these concerns across a spectrum of both environmental and civil rights and human rights areas, and this is extraordinarily important, and it is along with the youth coming in to lead us on these issues. This is one of the great developments that is hopeful that will begin to turn the corner here.
Well, and those are exactly the kinds of connections that pastors can make from their pulpits and invite their congregations, even if they're a little resistant to it, to begin to see by telling stories which, you've accumulated a lot of stories over the past year, Michael, and you could just go on, and Gus has accumulated those stories over decades and decades and decades, telling those stories to our congregations so that they begin to have a complex thought process, just like what this hour is offering to all of us.
And Gus, here's another reason, and I apologize that I don't let the government off the hook. And somebody made this.
As I began by saying, you can't trust these guys.
That somebody made this comment in the comments. They asked about the military and the spending on the military. And when we have as much spending as we have on the military, and our police forces have just as much spending as the military have, I have a problem with saying our government can't do this because they've got this much on their plate and they got that much on their plate. What's really going on here? I don't know if it's that they've got all this on their plate, or if they've just got some mixed priorities and we've forgotten about care.
Well, you know what's going on as well as I do, and I suspect many of our listeners here do. Eisenhower was right. There is a military-industrial complex in every congressional district. There are arms suppliers and arms creators of different sorts, and military bases, and on and on. And nobody. These politicians are pushed by this, so just as there's sort of inertia behind the fossil fuel business, there's inertia behind the military business, and for many of the same reasons and the same factors.
So Gus, let me just pick up on that, if I might. Obama, I don't know exactly what year it was when he said this, but in relation to climate change, he said, "Make me do this." And I quoted him sermon after sermon after sermon. And we're coming toward the end of our time, but I thought teeing you up for some final comments, Gus, with Obama echoing in my ears, "Make me do this." Here you are, Gus, with your decades of experience talking to a bunch of people of faith. Just go out helping us recognize that we have the power as people of faith, as congregations, as witnesses, as people with bodies who can put our bodies on the line. We have the power to make our governments do this. Would you just comment on that, Gus?
Well, I think if you look across the landscape at different communities that can be reached, we need to reach a lot of people quickly, and we need to reach them in their hearts and not in their pocketbooks, honestly. And we need to reach them with a message that resonates in their souls, if you will. And the faith communities are the best people in the world to do that, and are the most available people in the world. I mean, we could try to create something else, but we don't have to do it because we have so many people of faith in the country, We have so many dedicated people leading in those different faith communities. So it was extraordinary to me to see just, I think yesterday, day before, you probably know these people, the two of you, but the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Pope and
the ecumenical patriarch of the Orthodox Church
all came together and said, we've got to move this, and it was quite dramatic. And I think that's the kind of leadership we need from the faith community at all levels. Because the faith community, people of faith are interested in things that deal with their spiritual situations, and one of the deepest of our spiritual commitments is our care for each other, for different communities, for the planet, for other species. And that care is what motivates a lot of people. And what a number of the psychologists have told us is that people are complicated. You can think of a circle, and on one side of the circle, there's a person's psyche that's easily motivated by bad things, racial fears and other things. But almost all these people have a good side too. And if you can appeal to the good side, you can win them over. And I think the messenger is so important. People like me who are kind of, easily portrayed and correctly as, liberal, Democrat, etc. Well, left of liberal, probably. We're not great messengers, but the faith communities can reach people in a way that latte drinking, Volvo driving liberals can't, or scientists can't, for that matter.
Well, Gus, listen, you have been fantastic in this hour, and taught us a bunch, inspired us a bunch, and given us your own call to action. Michael, I'm going to invite you to do that as you traditionally do for this gathering in just one moment. But before I do, I want to put into the chat an organization that Bill McKibben has literally just launched in the past couple of days, called Third Act. And so the link to it is there, thirdact.org. Any of you folks that are 60 years old or over can sign up. And if you think like what 350 did to engage youth all around the world, Third Act is going to do that to engage people over 60 years old all around the world. So let's be in on the founding of this. I'm guessing we'll probably have a webinar that'll focus on it sometime in the next many months. But between now and then, I want to turn it back over to you, Michael, to close us out with a call to action. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jim, and thank you, Gus, for being with us. I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. And normally I would, again, do a call to action for us to get involved. I think that we've heard that considerably throughout this discussion. So I want to take personal privilege because I've got my dear friend, Jerry Friedman, on the call, and she is retiring from Elders Climate Action. And I want to take this time for the 141 participants, including her, that are here just to congratulate my dear friend and comrade, Jerry, on her retirement, because I look forward to getting there one day, and hopefully I'll be able to get there. So I'm going to appreciate and celebrate you while you're doing it. Thank you for your work. I also want to say thank you for your opportunities you've given me, and thank you for your mentorship throughout my journey in becoming. Thank you.
Well,
that's all for this time.
Thank you for having me.
Gus, you've been great. Thanks for your generosity of time, and I want to just encourage folks, if you want to read They Knew and learn about the Juliana versus the United States, or if you want to get one of Gus's other books, like this one on capitalism and its failures, or on systems theory. There's a wide array out there, and they're all excellent for preaching. I can attest to that myself.
It even come with all those notes all over it, like what Reb just held. We know you read it.
so I'm sure that everybody on this call is going to get an email about the next time we have a webinar. But until then, I'll bid you farewell. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you all for being with us.
Bye-bye.